Our next speaker is Jamie Spurgeon. Jamie joined Animal Charity Evaluators just this July, and since then he has been primarily working on this year's round of charity evaluations. Previously, he attended the University of Nottingham, where he obtained a master's degree in physics. To speak about animal advocacy research, please welcome Jamie Spurgeon.
Hi. So when I finished my degree about a year ago, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my career. And I was kind of interested in animal advocacy at the time, and I was just starting to learn about the effective altruism movement. But I didn't think that the skills and academic background that I had was at all relevant, and I didn't think that the opportunity to pursue a career in this field was available to me. And I was wrong. So the motivation for this talk is sort of to cover a variety of areas of animal advocacy research and look at a variety of different backgrounds to hopefully reveal some of the pathways into animal advocacy research. So I'm going to talk through intervention research in farmed animal advocacy, cultured animal products, and wild animal suffering research. And I'll go through the pathways into how you can get involved in pursuing this as a career. So firstly, interventions in farmed animal advocacy. When we talk about these interventions, we're talking about the sort of the methods that organizations are using to affect change for animals. So one of the big ones that we see is investigation research, where people will infiltrate factory farms and record footage that is then published online, and aims to affect individual diet change by exposing people to the situations in industrial agriculture. And it's also used as a tool in corporate outreach, where large institutions and food producers are targeted to get them to make welfare commitments, to make incremental changes to the welfare of large numbers of animals, and we're talking sort of in the region of hundreds of millions of animals here. And then on slightly the smaller scale, institutional outreach, where universities and hospitals and other institutions are targeted to encourage them to firstly source higher welfare animal products, and then introduce things like meatless Mondays to encourage meat reduction in the people that they're serving. And then finally, individual outreach, which is an umbrella for a variety of different interventions. So things like leafleting, online ads, pay-per-view videos, books and documentaries, and more novel approaches, as you can see in this photo. This is a virtual reality headset exhibition that was put on for members of the European Parliament by Animal Equality earlier this year. And we think things like this could be very effective, but we just don't know, and this is where the research comes into things. So the sort of, when we're thinking about research, we want to understand the effects of individual interventions, either compared to a control group or compared to other interventions. And also, research can also look in on a specific intervention and work out the most optimal way of delivering that particular intervention. Another important consideration is the audience. So are we targeting an intervention to a particular audience that we might already have, an organization may already have, or are we trying to find new audiences that particular interventions might be effective at dealing with? So I'm going to talk a little bit now about a study that Mercy for Animals did, just to give you an idea of what this sort of research involves. So they looked into their online ad program, and they ran an online ad that, when clicked on, it either led to an experiment group where they had one of their own videos encouraging individual diet change, and then half of the people received a control video on an unrelated topic of tropical diseases. And they tracked with cookies who landed on which page, and then 2 to 4 months later they followed this up with a survey. And that survey was powered to detect a 10% difference in consumption between the two groups. And when we look at the results of this, they found no statistically significant change. And part of the issue here is this study was was powered to detect a 10% change, and the sort of change that we may expect a single online ad to induce in diet is probably going to be a lot smaller than that. And it's certainly 10% is way above the threshold at which MFA would continue running this program, because the cost of getting an individual to click on an online ad is very small. So even a very small diet change applied to millions of people perhaps can still affect a large amount of change. And they didn't have an academic researcher work with them on developing this study, and we feel like if that had been the case, then some of these issues may have been avoided, and that's a common theme in a lot of animal advocacy research. So in terms of the pathway for this particular field, you're looking at ideally a social sciences background, particularly psychology and sociology, but also the maths and statistics and physics as well, and that sort of more analytical background can be useful in the sort of meta research that we do at ACE, and also that the Open Philanthropy Project do. And then from there, you can specialize further with a social sciences PhD. You want to be focusing on something that has a lot of study design, and particularly quantitative study design. And then we think the best thing to do from there is to pursue a career with an animal advocacy organization who are interested in conducting these studies. So Mercy for Animals, as I mentioned, the Humane League with their Humane League Labs research division, Animal Equality, and they're looking into the effectiveness of their VR headset program in conjunction with Faunalytics. And also at ACE, we've recently launched our own research division, and we'll be conducting independent research ourselves. To that end, we have also at ACE, we run an animal advocacy research fund. So this is particularly focused on funding intervention research, and we fund both academics and organizations. And we have 3 rounds each year for proposals. And yeah, I've just listed a few factors there for a successful proposal. And this is something that's good to be aware of, whatever stage through your career in this thing. Okay, I'm going to move on now and talk about cultured animal products. So cultured animal products are essentially animal products that are grown without the animals, and the idea is to reach a point where these are cost competitive enough to replace animal products and thus affect change for animals by reducing the demand for meat or traditional meat products. So we can divide animal products up into 2 categories. Firstly, acellular products, so products that are not composed of animal cells, and they tend to be simpler. So we're looking at milk and eggs. And this side of the movement is fairly well developed. So there's 2 major startups in this area. Clara Foods, who you can see here have made egg whites, and you can see the meringue there. They're working on producing the whole egg, and they've sort of started with the egg white. It's the simplest thing to make. And then also there's Perfect Day, who are working on growing milk. And we expect both of these to have products in the next few years. And then on the other side of things, the cellular animal products, so meat, there is a lot more research that needs to be done here before this will reach a point where it's cost competitive. We expect, again, you can divide this up into processed meats and whole meats. So processed meats like burgers, sausages, and like ground meat will come first, because the structures needed for them are a lot simpler. And then eventually we expect whole grown pieces of meat to be possible to achieve. And here you can see a turkey nugget that has been grown on using a jackfruit scaffolding structure. So it's kind of crossover between plant-based and animal-based grown meat. So in terms of the research, as I've said, the aim is to get this to a point where it's cost competitive. And as a result of that, this field is entirely dependent on having good researchers to break down the obstacles that are in the way of doing this. And as a result, there's a high potential here for individual impact. I think Lewis Bollard recently said in an interview that someone working in this field could be the equivalent of making a contribution of $1 million per year. And we're also seeing good funding from for-profit interests. So it represents a field where there's a lot of investment here and a lot of career opportunities as a result of that. So in terms of the pathway, there's 3 main academic backgrounds that we're looking at. Biology, and in particular bioengineering, anything that's involving tissue culture growth is particularly relevant. And then chemical engineering, in terms of scaling things up from growing in the lab to industrialization, things like looking at bioreactors and that sort of thing. And then finally food science, because at the end of the day, you need to have a product that tastes good. So taste and texture is very much within the realm of food science. And if you're looking to specialize and go into a PhD in this area, there are opportunities available. So New Harvest run an organization that run their fellowship program where they fund and provide support, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. They were also responsible for incubating those 2 acellular startups that I mentioned before. And in terms of a career, getting in contact with the Good Food Institute, who provide support, and they're an organization that have a central aim of bringing this into reality. And there are a large number of areas that they're involved in. And I will talk about them in a second as well. So New Harvest's fellowship program, they provide grants to PhD students, typically in the range of $100,000 to $250,000. And they provide project support through that period, weekly meetings and such. And importantly, they're available in the UK. So this is Scott Allen, who has recently, he's one of their new round of fellows, and he started work at the University of Bath in cultured meat bioprocess design. So he's looking at scaling up bioreactors into an industrial level and making that transition out of the lab. And then the Good Food Institute, so they operate in a variety of areas, but what's particularly relevant here is they connect students, scientists, and entrepreneurs together. And out of that, they form startups, and they help those startups in terms of development in a variety of areas. And certainly, if you're looking to go into this field, then it's they're the guys that you want to be in contact with and certainly be on their radar. And finally, I'm going to talk through wild animal suffering. So wild animal suffering is a very exciting area because the potential for impact is massive, but it is something that is very much in its infancy, and there's a huge need for more research to sort of understand what we're dealing with here. So it's the suffering of wild animals due to natural causes. And when we think about the numbers, if we look at the industrial agriculture movement, there's about 24 billion livestock animals estimated at the moment. But if we consider the average animal, which based on population would be an insect, for example, there are a billion insects. So the scale is far beyond where a lot of the movement is focused at the moment. But there are a lot of unanswered questions about whether it's something that should be pursued. So first of all, argument for sentience is not settled yet. And there needs to be more research to firstly establish whether insects, for example, do have sentience. And if that is the case, then are they living lives that are net negative? So are they suffering more than they are having pleasure in their lives? And if that is the case, then we need to think about how or whether we can develop interventions that would reduce that suffering. And the question of what our role is in that, because when we're trying to intervene in natural systems, the systems at play are very, very complex. So whilst it's difficult to develop interventions because if we might have good intentions in what we're trying to do, but the risk of having unforeseen consequences is very high. So this, at the moment, is very much in the realm of philosophy and ecology. Would probably be the two primary academic backgrounds that you're looking at. And the pathway here to a career is much less defined. There's not a lot of support from external groups, like I've mentioned in the previous examples. But pursuing a career in here, eventually you're going to be looking at either pursuing academia or getting in with a wild animal suffering focused organization. At the moment, there aren't many in existence, but I am going to talk about Wild Animal Suffering Research, who are a group that are funded by the Effective Altruist Animal Welfare Fund. And they produce research on ecology, welfare biology, and philosophy and economics, all surrounding wild animal suffering. And this is an image from a study, a research they released into the state of invertebrates and where we think that potential interventions could be used. And that concludes my talk. So thank you very much.
All right, so submit your questions at london.eaglobal.org/polls or through the app. We have a couple that have come in already, and you're going to be doing office hours, right? So people can
I will be doing office
track
hours,
you down for more one-on-one there. So the first question that came in is, how does cultured animal product research compare to plant-based alternative research in terms of timeline, tractability, expected impact, et cetera?
So at the moment with plant-based research, plant-based animal products, we're already seeing plant-based products, not animal products, sorry. We're seeing a lot of them on the market already. And there are several estimates as to when we'll start to see cost-competitive cultured animal products. I think Mark Post, who is involved with the Good Food Institute, puts an estimate at 10 years before we'll start to see that. At ACE, we've had a look and made our own estimates, and we think that we're sort of 90% confident that in 10 to 70 years we'll at least half of those products will exist in a cost-competitive way, and obviously that just reflects the level of uncertainty here at the moment. But it seems inevitable. It's just there's a lot of the time is somewhat uncertain.
Speaking of uncertainty, what sorts of interventions in the domain of wild animal suffering do you think might have a chance of being helpful?
It's tough because so I've seen some interventions suggested, such as euthanizing elderly elephants, for example, because they tend to reach an age where they can no longer feed themselves and they starve to death. So the idea with that is it's an intervention that's been suggested that likely won't really impact surrounding populations, and we're fairly certain that that sort of intervention won't have a significant impact and cause other problems and unforeseen issues. But the problem with that is that it's essentially going to be affecting a very small group of animals. And when we're looking at the most populous groups, such as insects, they're so interwoven into the food chain that it's very difficult, and we don't have an idea of what those interventions may look like at the moment, which is why we need the research to be done and built up over several years, I think, before we're going to see interventions that affect a large number of animals. And that's why we encourage generally farmed animal advocacy, because it's just far more tractable at the moment. And we think that it's going to be a lot easier to affect a larger amount of change there first.
Sort of a related question and a philosophical question. You had mentioned that a key question is, are certain wild animals living net negative lives? Mm-hmm. And so one person asks, is that really the right standard? Considering, for example, that we may think that many people who are in tough circumstances in poverty have net positive lives, mm-hmm. lives worth living, but we still feel very motivated to help them. So is there another standard that you'd consider aside from net positive versus net negative?
Yeah, so I will admit that this is an area that I'm not particularly knowledgeable on, but I think that is of the limited amount of research that's available at the moment, that is sort of the leading perspective to look on it, but it's certainly not the only perspective. I'm not sure I have too much more to add on that. But there is certainly room for a variety of other approaches, and I don't think that just looking at the net balance of an individual's life is the only way to think about things.
So questions continue to come in. We won't be able to get to them all, but for those that don't get their question asked, come see Jamie in
absolutely.
office hours. We do have time for a couple more at least. How specific does the academic background need to be for somebody to get into these various career paths? The questioner specifically asked about cultured meat, but I think it's probably a relevant question for all the different career paths. Is this something where, a master's in physics, kind of opens doors, or do you really need to be pretty niche already?
I think a lot of going to work for animal advocacy organizations, they're not going to be necessarily expecting you to have particularly relevant knowledge, I would say, from your degree, but it's things like it's skills. So from my background, for example, having the analytical skills that my physics degree has given me is relevant to the work I'm doing, but all of the knowledge that I've picked up was mostly through working at that organization. And in terms of cultured meat, I feel like it's more dependent on the knowledge that you may have in your degree. You're not going to be able to do the kind of research that's going to result in cultured meat without having the fundamental background in biology, chemical engineering, and food science, as I mentioned.
This might be a hard one, but somebody wants to kind of bottom line everything. If you had $1 million to spend based on your research, what's your number one place to spend it today?
My personal feel is that, in terms of my personal giving, the Good Food Institute is where the majority of that goes. I'm particularly optimistic about the progress that can be made with cultured meat. And I would say that's, personally, that's where I feel it's best.
For those that want more from you beyond office hours coming momentarily, where can they find you and follow you online?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow Animal Charity Evaluators. We've got Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And note down my email address if you want to get in contact at all. Then I'd be really happy to hear from anyone, and if I can help at all, that'd be great.
Awesome. How about a round of applause for Jamie Spurgeon? Thank you very much.